A single mom was harassed on a plane. She had no idea the man beside her was a senior Air Force officer. Emily Carter stepped onto the plane with a sigh that carried more than just exhaustion. It carried the weight of a week full of specialist appointments, long drives, and endless worrying. Her 2 young children trailed behind her, the older one holding tightly onto his favorite stuffed giraffe, the younger clinging to Emily's coat. She had flown from Chicago to Atlanta many times before, but never under such pressure. Her son, Luke, had just been diagnosed with a profound hearing impairment, and the medical consultation she had traveled for was both urgent and emotionally draining. Finding their assigned seats was a small relief. Row 12, right side. Emily ushered the children into the row, helping them with their seatbelts and stowing their small backpacks under the seats. She moved quickly, aware of the boarding line building behind her, and tried not to meet anyone's eyes. She knew what people thought when they saw a single mom boarding a plane with 2 kids: disruption, noise, inconvenience. She had felt those judgments before, and she braced herself for them again. As she settled into her seat, the man beside her offered a subtle nod and a soft, "Good morning." He was in his 50s, with salt and pepper hair and a book open on his lap. His demeanor was calm, composed, professional. Emily returned the greeting with a polite smile, grateful that he didn't try to make small talk. She wasn't in the mood to explain anything, not her son's condition, not why she was alone, not how tired she was. The cabin filled with the usual chorus of pre-flight activity, safety announcements, overhead bins slamming shut, murmured conversations, the beep of seatbelt signs coming on. Emily positioned herself between her children, calming them with soft words and familiar routines. Luke tugged at her sleeve, gesturing something she immediately understood. She handed him his noise-canceling headphones and turned on the tablet with his favorite visual stories. She glanced out the window as the plane began to taxi, her thoughts drifting briefly to what awaited her in Atlanta. Her parents had offered to help once she arrived, and though their relationship was strained, she was too tired to be anything but grateful. For now, all she wanted was 90 minutes of peace in the air, a chance to regroup, maybe close her eyes for a while. But peace, she would soon find, was not going to be part of this flight. Just as the plane lifted off the runway, Emily heard a sharp, exaggerated sigh from behind her. Then, clearly and deliberately loud, a man's voice rang out. "God, I can't believe they let people bring their brats on planes. This is why I always try for business class." Emily's breath caught. She didn't turn around. She kept her eyes on her son's tablet, pretending not to hear, but the words cut through her calm like a blade. She glanced at the man beside her, who didn't react. He simply turned a page in his book, his expression unchanged. Maybe he hadn't heard it. Or maybe, like her, he was choosing to ignore it. The voice continued, this time more pointed. "Parents these days think flying is some kind of family picnic. Some of us paid good money for peace and quiet." There was a low murmur of discomfort among nearby passengers, but no one said anything. Emily's face flushed. Her daughter stirred beside her, sensitive to her mother's tension. She adjusted the seatbelt on the child's lap, her hands slightly trembling. She had been through enough to know that confrontations, especially in enclosed spaces like an airplane, rarely ended well. Still, she couldn't help but feel the familiar sting, of being judged, of being seen as a problem simply for existing with children in tow. The plane reached cruising altitude, and the flight attendants began their service. Emily tried to focus on keeping her children settled. She handed out snacks, opened juice boxes, wiped crumbs from tiny hands. The tasks were routine, automatic, and they kept her from unraveling. She could still hear the man behind her grumbling intermittently, but she shut it out as best she could. The man beside her, still reading quietly, hadn't said another word. Emily found herself wondering who he was. He wore a navy blue blazer and tan slacks, neatly pressed, and a small silver pin gleamed subtly on his lapel. There was something composed about him, something almost practiced. Still, he remained a stranger. And Emily was used to facing the world alone. She rested her head back against the seat, closing her eyes for a moment, hoping the rest of the flight would pass quickly. But something in her gut told her that the worst was yet to come. The plane hummed steadily in its ascent, a mechanical lullaby that usually calmed Emily's nerves. But her mind was alert, keyed up by the uneasy atmosphere surrounding her. The loud complaints from the man in the row behind her hadn't faded. If anything, they had grown sharper, more targeted, like he wanted everyone around him to know exactly how displeased he was. She kept her head forward, focusing on her children. Her daughter, Hannah, was playing quietly with a soft doll, whispering stories only she could hear. Luke remained absorbed in his tablet, occasionally glancing up at his mother for reassurance. They were doing well, considering the circumstances. Emily had spent years teaching them how to behave in public spaces, aware that any slip would be met with scrutiny. This flight was no different. Then came another muttered remark, louder this time, followed by a fake cough. "This is just great," the man scoffed. "Screaming kids and a mother who thinks a plane is a daycare. Typical." Emily felt her jaw tighten. Still, she said nothing. Her silence was not acceptance, it was a shield. Confrontation was a fire she didn't have the strength to stoke. She had learned to pick her battles, especially in situations where no one else seemed eager to step in. The man behind her shifted in his seat. The sound of his belt clinking and his foot tapping made her uneasy. She could sense his presence like a storm building too close for comfort. Another comment came, nastier this time, "Why don't people like you just drive instead of ruining flights? For the rest of us?" The word struck her like ice water. She glanced sideways to gauge the reaction of the man seated next to her, but he remained still, his face unreadable, eyes still trained on his book. For a brief moment, Emily wondered if anyone on this plane cared about what was happening. If anyone had heard clearly. If anyone would defend her. She pressed her fingers against her temple, forcing herself to breathe slowly. Her children didn't fully understand the tension. Luke was nonverbal, and while Hannah sensed something was wrong, she was too young to grasp the full weight of the situation. That both comforted and pained Emily. They didn't deserve this, not today, not ever. Unbelievable. The voice behind her snapped again. The rest of us could enjoy our flight. Maybe if she knew how to control them. This time, the muttering shifted from passive-aggressive to overt hostility. The man leaned forward slightly, and Emily felt a sudden nudge on the back of her seat. Not strong enough to be physical aggression, but enough to be noticed. Enough to say, "I want you to know I'm here. And I'm not done." Emily sat up straighter, instinctively shielding her children. Her heart pounded. She wanted to say something, but what? That she was sorry. That she was doing her best. That she, more than anyone, wanted a peaceful flight. She knew those words would only feed his contempt. The flight attendant passed by, pushing a cart with drinks and snacks, smiling mechanically at each passenger. Emily looked up, catching her attention. "Excuse me," she said softly, her voice tight. "There's a man behind us making comments about my children. I wanted to let someone know." The attendant, a woman in her late 20s, leaned slightly closer but didn't stop rolling the cart. "Unfortunately, we can't intervene unless there's a physical incident," she said, her tone polite but detached. "We encourage all passengers to resolve small issues calmly among themselves." Emily blinked, stunned. "He's harassing us." The attendant paused, clearly uncomfortable. "Ma'am, if you're feeling unsafe, I can file a report with the crew, but I can't change your seats or ask him to move unless something escalates. We'll keep an eye on it." With that, she nodded and continued down the aisle, her cart rattling softly behind her. Emily turned back in her seat, a hollow ache settling in her chest. She felt the weight of every pair of eyes that might be watching, judging, ignoring, or merely curious. None of it helped. Behind her, the man chuckled to himself, a dry, grating sound. "Sensitive these days. Guess some people are just too." Emily shut her eyes for a second, holding back the sting of tears. The pressure in her chest swelled, but she forced herself to focus on her breathing. She didn't want her children to see her break. Not here. Not now. The man beside her finally moved. He shifted in his seat, closing his book and placing it gently in the pocket in front of him. Emily glanced at him, catching the edge of a rectangular tag clipped to his jacket. It bore an insignia she didn't fully recognize, a combination of stars and wings in silver. His name was embossed beneath it, Colonel Thomas Reed. He wasn't looking at her. His eyes were focused straight ahead, calm and unbothered, as though he had been listening to every word and waiting for the right moment to respond. But for now, he said nothing. His silence felt deliberate, calculated. Emily turned back toward the window. Her reflection was faint in the scratched plastic, but she could see the fatigue etched into her face. She wondered how much longer the flight would last. How many more quiet humiliations she would have to endure before it ended. A tap came again on her seat back. A gentle but mocking rhythm. Tap tap. Tap tap. Emily didn't turn. Her grip on her knees tightened, her fingernails pressing against the fabric of her jeans. And still, no one said a word. The tension in the cabin was no longer subtle. It pulsed in the recycled air, heavy and inescapable. Emily sat rigidly in her seat, shoulders taut, her fingers pressed into her lap as if bracing for impact. The man behind her had grown bolder. What began as snide remarks had turned into direct and pointed aggression. And no one around her was stepping in to stop it. She tried once again to calm Luke, whose fidgeting had increased. He tapped on the tablet in a series of erratic gestures, clearly unsettled by the unease around him. Emily gave him a reassuring touch on the shoulder, even as her own hands trembled. Hannah leaned into her side, sensing the discomfort more than understanding it. Emily kissed the top of her daughter's head, whispering something soothing she barely heard herself say. Then came the moment she had been dreading. A firm tug on the back of her seat startled her. Not the casual bump of a knee or the accidental nudge of a bag, but a deliberate grasp, short and tight. Before she could react, a low voice growled just inches from her ear, full of disdain and vitriol. "You should have stayed home if you can't control your damn kids." Emily froze. Her throat closed. There was no longer any ambiguity. The man was not just voicing complaints to the air. He was speaking directly to her, without fear or shame, as though entitled to humiliate her in front of an entire cabin of witnesses. She turned her head slightly, just enough to catch a glimpse of his face. Red-cheeked, squinting. With frustration, he leaned back with a sneer as if proud of what he'd said. His eyes briefly locked with hers before he scoffed and looked away. Her voice wavered as she tried to respond. "Please stop. My children aren't bothering you." He chuckled again. "They're bothering everyone. You're just too self-absorbed to see it." Her stomach nodded, a sickening twist that made her feel small and exposed. She wanted to stand up, scream, demand help. But all she could do was sit there, blinking away the hot tears that burned behind her eyes. She pressed her palm against her chest, trying to steady her breath. Up ahead, the flight attendant who had spoken with her earlier glanced in her direction and quickly looked away. She wasn't going to help. Emily knew that now. The tap came again, mocking, rhythmic. Tap tap. Tap tap. This time, it was accompanied by another murmur. "Maybe someone will finally do something. Just wait till they start screaming." Then Emily's body trembled with suppressed rage. Not only because of the man's words, but because of the silence that surrounded them. The complicity. The way every other passenger sat frozen in their seats, headphones on, eyes averted, as though nothing out of the ordinary was happening. She looked down and noticed that Luke's juice box had fallen to the floor. She bent to pick it up, using the motion to shield her face. Her cheeks were wet. The tears had escaped despite her effort to contain them. She wiped them away quickly, hoping the children hadn't seen. When she sat upright again, her eyes met those of the man seated beside her. Colonel Reed. He wasn't reading anymore. His hands were resting on his thighs, and he was looking at her, not with pity, but with an intensity that suggested he had been listening closely. Their eyes met for only a second before he looked away again, silent. Emily couldn't tell whether he was judging her, processing the situation, or simply choosing to remain uninvolved. She had no idea who he was beyond the glint of silver on his chest, the calm precision in his posture, the way he hadn't flinched once during the growing storm around them. The man behind her wasn't finished. A moment later, as if the harassment needed punctuation, he leaned forward again and hissed. "People like you don't belong in public if you can't behave. What kind of mother are you?" That did it. Emily turned around, fully now, facing him. Her voice was unsteady but firm. "Again. You've said enough. Don't speak to me." He smirked, unconcerned. "Or what? You'll cry harder." Before Emily could respond, the sudden shift in her son's tablet volume drew her attention back to the children. Luke had accidentally turned up the audio, and the noise startled Hannah. In the confusion, she knocked over her cup, sending a small splash of apple juice onto Emily's jeans and the floor. The man behind her clapped sarcastically. "There it is. There's the meltdown we were all waiting for." Several passengers turned their heads this time. A middle-aged woman too rose up, frowned, but didn't speak. A man across the aisle looked away again, choosing not to engage. Emily's cheeks flushed with humiliation, and she turned back to her children, reaching for napkins, trying to clean the mess with trembling hands. And then, without warning, the final blow came. As the man returned from what must have been a trip to the restroom, he walked past Emily's row with exaggerated slowness. Just as he reached their seats, he bumped hard into her arm, an unmistakable, deliberate move. The collision knocked the cup in her hand out of her grip, sending the remaining juice cascading down onto Luke's lap and seat. Emily gasped, trying to catch the cup mid-air, but it was too late. Luke froze, then began to rock in place, distressed by the sudden wetness and noise. Emily reached for him, her voice trembling with apologies. The cabin, for the first time, fell into complete silence. Passengers had seen the contact. They had seen the result. Eyes shifted. Tension crackled in. The air like a wire stretched too tight. Emily looked up at the man as he returned to his seat, satisfied. Her voice rose, no longer shaking but edged with fury. That was on purpose. He shrugged, feigning innocence. Space. Maybe you should watch where your arms go. It's a tight. It was only then that Colonel Reed moved. Without a word, he stood from his seat in one smooth motion, tall and composed. He stepped forward slightly, angled just enough to place himself between Emily and the man behind her. His voice, when he finally spoke, was calm and deliberate, but laced with authority so unmistakable it made the surrounding silence feel deafening. I believe that's enough. And just like that, the air shifted again. Not with rage, but with presence. The kind that commanded attention without raising volume, the kind that said, someone is now in control. Emily could feel the weight of every breath in the cabin. Her mind was still spinning from the sudden shift. One moment the aggressor's latest provocation had gone unchallenged, the next the calm and unassuming man beside her had risen with a command that hung in the air like a silent alarm. I believe that's enough. He had said, not as a suggestion, but as a final statement. It hadn't been shouted, but it stopped time. The man behind her paused, lips twitching in a smirk that tried to hide his uncertainty. It was as if he hadn't expected anyone to challenge him, least of all a man who had sat silently for most of the flight. But Colonel Reed didn't flinch. He stood firm, eyes locked on the space just past Emily. A quiet wall of presence that needed no explanation. Emily looked up at Reed, eyes wide with equal parts confusion and tentative hope. For a heartbeat, it felt like something might shift in her favor. But then, the moment passed. Reed sat back down slowly, deliberately. He didn't look at Emily again. She watched him for another second, as if trying to read between the lines of his silence, but his expression was impossible to decipher. The interruption had stunned the aggressor, but only briefly. The man behind them let out a dramatic sigh, followed by another mocking tap on the back of Emily's seat. Oh great! He said, his voice rising again. Now we've got the silent hero act. This just gets better. Emily couldn't take it anymore. She pressed the call button above her head, holding it longer than necessary, as if that extra second might summon more urgency. The small light illuminated above her, casting a faint blue glow that matched the dull ache in her chest. A nearby flight attendant noticed and made her way down the narrow aisle. Her steps were brisk, but her face showed more fatigue than concern. Yes, ma'am, she asked, her voice polite but weary. Emily kept her tone measured, though her hands trembled. This man, she said, gesturing toward the seat behind her without turning, has been harassing me and my children since the flight started. He's made multiple comments, bumped into me intentionally, and just now caused my son to spill juice all over himself. The attendant's eyes shifted briefly to Colonel Reed, who nodded once in silent corroboration. I understand. The attendant said carefully, her gaze flicking over to the man behind them. Unfortunately, unless there's a safety concern, we can't ask anyone to change seats mid-flight. We really do encourage passengers to resolve personal issues calmly and respectfully. Emily blinked. So you're saying there's nothing you can do? The attendant's voice dropped slightly. I can speak to him, if you'd like. Ask him to be more mindful. But we can't force a move or issue warnings without a formal report. And, respectfully. We're trying to maintain a smooth environment for all passengers. A smooth environment? Emily repeated, her voice rising, incredulous. Verbal attacks. He bumped me. He caused a scene. He's been making. I understand your frustration, ma'am. I really do. The attendant said, softening her tone. You like me to bring a towel or assist with the spill? Would. Emily's eyes filled with tears. The spill. That was the concern they were willing to address. Not the insults. Not the aggression. Just the juice. No. She said quietly. Forget it. Hannah watched her mother with wide, solemn eyes. The man behind them spoke again, now with a mocking tone. Come prepared with a better sob story. Nice try. Maybe next time you'll. Emily turned her head sharply but said nothing. Every cell in her body was burning with helplessness. She had done everything she was told to do. She had asked for help. She had kept her voice down. She had followed the rules. And still, nothing had changed. Colonel Reed sat beside her, still composed, but unmoving. Emily felt a flicker of resentment rise. Why had he stood up, only to sit back down and say nothing else? Had that one sentence been the extent of his help? It had barely deflected the man's behavior. Her thoughts were interrupted by Luke shifting in his seat again. She leaned over and wiped his hands, then gave him a reassuring squeeze. She whispered into his ear, hoping he could feel the meaning even if he couldn't hear the words. Across the aisle, a couple exchanged glances but said nothing. A man in front of them lowered his tray table and pulled out a book, retreating into its pages. The silence from the other passengers spoke volumes. Emily's own silence turned into something else, into survival. She pulled her children closer, held them tightly, and stared straight ahead. Her face was blank. Now, the kind of numb stillness born not from calm, but from exhaustion so deep it reached her bones. She didn't even flinch when the tapping started again behind her. Tap tap. Tap tap. She closed her eyes and imagined they were somewhere else. Not on a plane, not in this moment. Somewhere where kindness wasn't optional. Somewhere where a mother trying her best wasn't open season for cruelty. The cabin remained quiet, save for the hum of engines and the occasional clatter of drink carts. No one stepped in. No one asked questions. Emily sat with her children, surrounded by silence. Unseen. Except by one. Colonel Reed did not speak. But his eyes, when they met hers briefly once more, held a different kind of silence. The kind that did not retreat but calculated. Still, for Emily, that moment felt like another failure in a string of many. She had reached out for help, and nothing had changed. The quiet after the failed intervention was heavier than anything Emily had felt since the flight began. The sense of isolation settled deep in her bones, a cold and persistent ache that not even the hum of the aircraft or the soft chatter of distant passengers could thaw. She sat motionless now, hands folded tightly in her lap, her gaze fixed ahead as if looking through the seat in front of her. Luke had calmed slightly, chewing absent-mindedly on the corner of his tablet's case. Hannah had curled into her mother's side, her tiny hand holding onto Emily's shirt like a lifeline. Emily's eyes stung, but she refused to let more tears fall. She had already shown too much weakness. Behind her, the man who had tormented her for the better part of the flight had grown quieter. But the damage lingered. Every second she remained in that seat felt like a punishment. Her children were quiet, but her body stayed tense, expecting another cruel remark, another jolt to the back of her seat, another moment of humiliation. She leaned forward to retrieve a clean napkin from the seat pocket in front of her, brushing her arm against the man beside her as she did. She mumbled a reflexive apology, not even expecting acknowledgement. But this time, she noticed something she hadn't before. On his lap, resting just atop his folded blazer, was a sleek leather folder. Its edge peeked out from beneath his hand, revealing a crisp emblem in silver foil. Not the airline logo, but something else, an insignia shaped like a shield overlaid with an eagle and wings. Above it, in small, precise lettering, she saw the words, United States Air Force. Her eyes widened slightly, and she took in the detail more fully. The badge clipped to his jacket was no longer just a vague metallic glint in her memory, it was shaped like a star surrounded by laurel leaves. Her gaze followed the name engraved beneath it, Colonel Thomas Reed. She blinked. The man who had said almost nothing the entire flight. The man who had stood once with quiet authority and then retreated into silence. A colonel in the U.S. Air Force, sitting quietly while a mother and her children endured humiliation. Emily wasn't sure what to make of the revelation. On one hand, it validated her instinct that he wasn't just another passenger. On the other, it raised more questions than answers. Why had he remained so quiet? Why had he not used his authority earlier, when the situation first escalated? She turned her head slightly, watching him from the corner of her eye. Colonel Reed sat still, his hands resting over the folder as if guarding its contents, but his eyes weren't fixed on the page of his book anymore. They were forward, alert. He wasn't reading. He was observing. Emily returned her gaze to the seat back in front of her. Her mind worked quickly, running through everything that had happened so far, trying to reconcile his presence with his silence. It wasn't cowardice, that much she was sure of. Something about him felt too deliberate, too measured. Then she realized something else. Each time the man behind them had grown too loud, too disruptive, Reed had subtly shifted. A glance. A hand moved. A pause in his page turning. As if he were tracking, noting, storing each detail. Emily felt a flicker of something unfamiliar. Was it suspicion, or hope? Her own background didn't intersect with the military, but she'd read enough to recognize the kind of discipline that came from years of command. Reed hadn't ignored the situation. He had been calculating. Waiting. But for what? Emily's thoughts spiraled again, interrupted only by the renewed motion of the beverage cart returning for trash pickup. She reached for a few of the now empty cups and snack wrappers, stacking them neatly. As she leaned forward again, Reed finally spoke. "He's escalating," he said quietly, not looking at her. Emily turned her head, startled by the sound of his voice after so much silence. Replied, her voice low. "I know. I've been tracking his behavior since we left the gate." He continued. "You've handled yourself well." It wasn't a compliment. It was a report. A statement of fact. Emily didn't know whether to feel validated or unnerved. "Why haven't you said anything?" she asked, the tension in her voice barely contained. "I needed to observe a consistent pattern before I acted." He replied, his voice even. "Incident is misconduct. Two might be circumstantial. But a pattern, documented, corroborated, that's actionable." 1. Emily stared at him, confusion clouding her expression. "Actionable for what? You're not a marshal." "No," he said simply. "But I am an officer bound by federal code to report violations of civil conduct and security risk behavior on federal transport." I've already begun a log. She blinked again, unsure how to respond. You've been documenting this? He nodded once. His speech patterns, proximity invasions, deliberate provocations, and your responses. I've recorded timestamps in a field log. Emily exhaled slowly. So you've just been waiting? Not waiting, he said. Preparing. The words landed with more gravity than she expected. It was not reassurance, not comfort, it was strategy. And in that moment, she saw him not as a passive bystander, but as a man. Accustomed to operating under protocols, one who measured his actions against objectives, not feelings. But why not intervene earlier, she asked, her voice sharper now. He met her eyes for the first time with real intent. Because if I act too soon without justification, I become a participant, not an enforcer. And if I act without witnessing a direct threat, I jeopardize the chain of authority. But if I act at the right moment, with undeniable evidence, my word holds. Wait. Emily didn't respond right away. Her body was still reeling from the earlier interactions, and this new layer of complexity only added to her exhaustion. But beneath the fatigue, something else stirred. Maybe he wasn't her defender. Maybe he was something more clinical. More precise. But at least he saw her. At least someone was watching. And not just watching, but recording. Remembering, preparing. She nodded slightly, absorbing the weight of his words. Behind her, the man had fallen into a temporary silence, possibly aware that something had shifted in the row ahead. The power dynamic, once firmly in his control, now teetered on a fragile edge. Emily sat back slowly, her mind turning over every detail she had previously dismissed as meaningless. The glances, the timing, the badge. She wasn't alone, not entirely. Not anymore. The hush that had blanketed the section of the cabin surrounding Emily and her children was not calm, it was suspended tension. Every passenger nearby seemed to sense that something was unraveling, something approaching a point from which it couldn't be pulled back. Emily remained seated, her body a knot of stiff nerves, barely moving except to check on Luke's comfort or reposition Hannah when the little girl shifted. Colonel Reed had returned to his rigid, silent observation, though now his presence carried a different weight. Not a passive one, but expectant, as if waiting for the next blow that would justify action. It didn't take long. The man behind them stood abruptly, brushing his shoulder along the edge of Emily's seat as he did, his movement exaggerated in a space that allowed no such carelessness. Emily tensed. But didn't look at him. She could feel the heat of his body as he loomed behind her for a moment. Too long, then stepped into the narrow aisle and made his way toward the rear lavatory. Hannah stirred beside her, and Luke paused in his tapping on the screen. Even they could feel it, the air thick with invisible danger, the kind that children don't understand but instinctively fear. Emily tried to calm her racing thoughts, pressing her hand gently to Luke's chest to steady his breathing. He responded with a slow blink, then returned to the soft hum of his tablet. Minutes passed. 5, maybe 6. The man returned from the restroom, his steps slower than before, as if dragging each one out for effect. His eyes swept the cabin lazily, then landed back on his seat. He approached, and that's when it happened. Instead of sliding in cleanly to his row, he twisted his body toward the aisle, letting his arms swing wide. In a moment too fast for Emily to brace, his elbow connected hard with her shoulder, knocking it into the armrest. At the same time, the tray on her lap tipped, sending the remnants of a juice box tumbling down toward her son's legs again. Luke flinched violently and let out a sharp, startled cry. Emily shot forward, shielding her son with both arms. Then she'd ever allowed herself to be on a plane. "Stop," she snapped, her voice louder. The man didn't retreat. He stood there, towering over her, a slight grin playing at the corner of his mouth. "It's a tight space," he said mockingly. "Maybe keep your kids under control if you don't want accidents." Colonel Reed was already in motion. He rose not with aggression, but with precision. A single, fluid motion, like a switch flipping from dormant to active. He stepped into the aisle and turned directly toward the aggressor, his frame blocking the man's view of Emily completely. Reed's voice, when he spoke, was calm but charged with unmistakable authority. "Sir," he said, "you've made physical contact with another passenger. That qualifies as an incident under federal aviation regulations. I am formally requesting you sit down and remain quiet for the rest of this flight." The man looked him up and down, his smirk faltering. "Gonna do, write me a citation? This isn't the military." "Oh, come on," he scoffed. "What are you?" Reed didn't move. "I am Colonel Thomas Reed, United States Air Force. I am an appointed ethics and conduct liaison for multiple federal oversight programs, including those that govern public behavior in restricted transport zones. I have already compiled a detailed report of your actions, complete with timestamps and witness corroboration. If you refuse to comply, I will request immediate intervention from the flight crew and initiate an onboard misconduct protocol." A silence fell so sudden it was almost audible. Passengers nearby turned now, fully, not in sidelong glances but outright attention. The tension had drawn them in, and now Reed's words had given them clarity. This wasn't a spat between travelers. This was a documented confrontation, and one party was speaking with the force of a system behind him. The man's eyes narrowed. "So what, now you're gonna play hero?" "I don't need to play anything," Reed answered, his voice like steel. "You've already done everything necessary to escalate this to an enforceable level. Now sit down." The man opened his mouth as if to retort, but no words came. Not a single passenger spoke up in his defense. The cabin, once thick with avoidance, now brimmed with silent expectation. It was not just Emily watching. It was everyone. After a long pause, the man muttered something under his breath and dropped into his seat. The sudden thud of his body against the cushion was followed by the abrupt slam of the tray table he lowered, as though trying to reclaim a shred of control. But it was gone. Reed remained standing for another few seconds, ensuring there would be no immediate retaliation, then slowly returned to his seat. He adjusted his blazer with exacting care, sat beside Emily, and resumed his posture as though nothing unusual had happened. Emily sat frozen. Her shoulder ached from the contact. Luke clutched her sleeve tightly. Hannah buried her face in her mother's arm. And in the wake of it all, Emily felt the flicker of something unfamiliar: safety. It wasn't relief, not yet. The incident was far from over, and the man behind her still seethed with unspent venom. But she was no longer alone. For the first time on this flight, someone had said, clearly and without hesitation, that what was happening to her mattered. Reed did not speak again. He opened the leather folder once more and continued writing. Not dramatically, not in a show of public service, but methodically, as if every detail had to be precise, complete, irrefutable. Emily didn't interrupt. She leaned into her children, her mind racing but her body still. Something had changed, not in the man behind her, not even in Reed, but in her. For the first time since the flight began, she wasn't shrinking. She wasn't silent. She had spoken, and her voice had not vanished into the void. She had been seen. And someone had answered. Emily sat motionless for what felt like an eternity, her breath shallow, her senses narrowed to the space around her children and the man who had, in a single commanding moment, brought the cabin to a standstill. Colonel Reed's words continued to echo in her mind, not because they had been loud, but because of how clearly they had landed. She had never seen anyone speak like that, with such steady authority, without ever raising his voice. It was as if the air itself had reshaped to accommodate the weight of what he'd said. Behind her, the man who had tormented her remained in his seat, his movements sharp and agitated. He muttered to himself now, quieter, but no less venomous. His tray table rattled as he pushed it back up with unnecessary force. He crossed and uncrossed his arms. His foot tapped against the floor with an anxious rhythm that didn't match the bravado he'd displayed earlier. Emily didn't turn around again. She wouldn't give him that. She kept her eyes ahead, her hand resting on Luke's arm, her body leaned toward Hannah. But inside, the balance of power had shifted. It was Reed who moved next, slow and deliberate, standing once more with a crisp fluidity that drew the eye without demanding it. This time, he didn't look at the man behind them. He stepped into the aisle, turned toward the front of the cabin, and walked calmly in the direction of the galley, where two flight attendants were preparing beverage refills and checking passenger logs. One of them looked up as he approached. Though Emily couldn't hear his words, she watched their faces. Reed didn't gesture, didn't over-explain. He simply spoke. The older of the two attendants, a man with graying hair and a deep crease across his brow, nodded sharply and pulled a small tablet from his belt. The younger one walked swiftly past Reed, heading toward the cockpit. Within moments, Reed returned and resumed his seat beside Emily. She looked at him, her expression still raw with confusion and disbelief, but she didn't speak. She didn't need to. He gave a single nod, not of comfort, but confirmation. Then, from the overhead system, a soft chime rang out, and the captain's voice broke through the silence. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're currently cruising at 33,000 feet and will be adjusting our flight plan slightly due to air traffic ahead. Please remain seated as our crew continues to provide service." It was the most ordinary announcement in the world. But Emily knew, in her gut, that something else had just begun. The change in route. The sudden urgency. The quiet that followed the captain's words. It wasn't routine. The man behind her didn't understand. Yet. Another 15 minutes passed. The flight attendants returned with drinks, but this time their posture was different. The older one, who had spoken with Reed, paused briefly at their row and leaned in just enough for Emily to hear. "Ma'am," he said. "Ask for your continued patience. We're aware of the situation. We're coordinating with the captain." "I need to." Emily nodded, stunned. "Thank you," she whispered, her throat dry. The man nodded once, then moved on. Across the aisle, a middle-aged woman who had remained silent for the entire flight now reached for Emily's arm as the cart passed. Her voice was low, uncertain. "I saw what he did. I didn't know what to say earlier. I'm sorry." Emily gave her a faint, exhausted smile. "Thank you." Behind her, the tapping began again, soft at first, then more aggressive. Tap tap. Tap tap. The flight attendant stopped the cart and turned. "To stop touching the seat in front of you, sir," he said, voice calm but cold. "I need you." The man scoffed. "Are you serious? She's been causing all the problems." The attendant's expression didn't change. "Sir, this is your final warning. Please keep your hands and comments to yourself. We are preparing to report this matter to authorities upon landing." That was it. The man exploded. "Oh, come on," he shouted, pushing his tray table down hard. "Been dealing with this circus for the whole flight and now I'm the problem? This is insane. I'm the one who's—" The cabin jolted at the volume. People twisted in their seats. Someone gasped audibly from 2 rows back. A baby began to cry somewhere up front. The older flight attendant stepped forward now, flanked by the younger one. "Sir, you need to calm down," he said firmly. "You've been verbally abusive to a fellow passenger, and your behavior has now escalated to physical aggression and disruption of flight operations. You're required to stay seated and silent until we land." "And if I don't?" the man snapped. The attendant didn't answer. He simply tapped a button on his tablet. Within seconds, a new announcement echoed from the cockpit. "Attention crew, please prepare for an unscheduled stop at our alternate landing destination. Protocol 7 is in effect." Emily felt her stomach drop. So did the man behind her. "What the hell does that mean?" he barked. Reed stood again, turning slightly in his seat but not fully facing him. "The one in control. It means you're no longer." The man's bluster faltered. "You people are out of your minds." No one answered. For the first time since the flight began, Emily felt the subtle shift of real consequence wrap itself around the man who had been so confident in his cruelty. There was no power left in his voice. Now, only panic masquerading as outrage. The flight attendants retreated briefly, preparing for the early landing. Reed remained standing. Eyes alert but not confrontational, arms folded. He was no longer an observer. He was the line that had been drawn, and now, enforced. Emily sat back in her seat, the noise of the plane returning to her slowly. Luke leaned his head on her arm. Hannah took her mother's hand and squeezed it gently. The tapping had stopped. All that remained now was the descent. The cabin was no longer just tense, it was transformed. Every passenger had become acutely aware that something serious was unfolding, that this flight was no longer routine. The announcement of an unscheduled stop had cut through the hum of jet engines like a razor. Even those who had tried to ignore the earlier conflict now leaned forward in their seats or craned their necks to catch glimpses of the row where everything had begun. Emily kept her eyes on her children, her hand stroking Luke's back in slow, steady motions, though her own chest rose and fell with uneven breaths. Hannah gripped her mother's arm and looked up at her, searching for a clue, a hint that things were okay. Emily managed a tight smile. But it didn't reach her eyes. She didn't know what to expect anymore, not from the flight, not from the man behind her, and not even from Colonel Reed, who stood as unmoving as a statue beside their row. The man in seat 13C had stopped muttering. His bravado, once an impenetrable wall, had given way to silence, bitter, volatile silence. He sat stiffly, arms crossed, jaw clenched, eyes darting across the cabin. He wasn't used to losing control, and it showed. The earlier arrogance had dissolved into something meaner, more erratic, as though he was calculating how to reclaim some sliver of dominance before it was too late. The younger flight attendant reappeared, this time without a cart, walking directly to Colonel Reed. She handed him a small device, something compact and black, with a flashing red light. He examined it briefly, then returned it with a nod. Emily watched this interaction in silence. It was strange to see how naturally the crew deferred. To Reed now, not as if he were a passenger giving a suggestion, but as someone holding an unspoken authority above their own. He had shifted from being a silent figure beside her to a central node in the chain of command, all without a badge or uniform visible. Then came the captain's voice again, steady and clipped. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. Due to a passenger-related incident requiring formal documentation, we will be making a brief stop in Nashville for personnel support. We appreciate your cooperation and ask that all passengers remain seated with seatbelts fastened." The words hit the cabin like a gust of wind. Nashville. They weren't far now. Emily looked out the window instinctively, but all she saw were clouds and sky. The illusion of peace. From behind her, the man exploded again. "This is ridiculous. She's the one who's causing all the noise. These brats have been out of control since we boarded and no one says anything. But I speak up and I'm the villain." His voice cracked with fury, louder than before, but there was something different in it now, an edge of desperation. No one responded. Not a single person offered support. Even those who had been silent were now shaking their heads, whispering to one another, frowning at him openly. "You people are all the same," he went on, louder still. "Fall for a sob story and ignore what's actually going on. You're all sheep. She's using those kids to manipulate everyone, and none of you have the guts to see it." Colonel Reed finally turned. He faced the man squarely, not from a place of anger, but duty. "You've crossed every boundary of civility and safety aboard this aircraft," he said. "Your words, your actions, and your refusal to follow directions have now made you a direct threat to the order of this flight. You will be detained upon landing. Any further disruption will only add to your charges." The man laughed, a sharp and empty sound. "Charges? You're not a cop." "No," Reed said. "I'm the officer who documented everything you did, witnessed by civilians and flight staff. And in 15 minutes, the people who are cops will meet this plane." The man stood up abruptly. Passengers gasped. The older flight attendant stepped forward immediately, raising his hands in a placating gesture. "Sir, you need to sit down," he said. "Now. I want to speak to the captain," the man shouted. "Against me for nothing. This whole thing is a setup. You're all turning." Reed didn't move. "You are making it worse." Emily's heart pounded. She pressed her children closer, her body shielding them instinctively. The man glanced around, realizing he had no support. Even the people directly across the aisle refused to meet his eyes now. His face flushed a deep red. He pointed at Emily, voice shaking with fury. "She's just pretending. She's got everyone fooled, acting like a victim." A voice came from 3 rows back. "I saw you push past her. Twice." Another voice followed. "And I heard everything you said. Don't act like we didn't." The floodgate had opened. More passengers turned, voicing their accounts, offering what they had witnessed. A woman across the aisle began scrolling through her phone and raised it slightly. "I recorded the whole thing," she said. "From the first comment. I've got video." The man's face froze. For the first time, true fear flickered across his expression. He stood motionless, caught in the weight of the truth unraveling around him. He had bullied his way through the flight assuming anonymity would protect him. But now his words were preserved, replayable, shareable. He sat back down slowly, saying nothing. The older flight attendant spoke into his mic quietly, his voice intended for the cockpit. "We're secure." Colonel Reed sat down as well, folding his hands again over the folder in his lap. Emily exhaled a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding for the last several minutes. Her muscles ached from the tension of protecting her children. She closed her eyes, her body trembling not from fear now, but release. Beside her, Reed spoke softly. "You did nothing wrong." Emily opened her eyes and looked at him. "I was starting to think I imagined it all." "You didn't," he said. "And now, there's proof." Outside the window, the clouds began to thin. The first hints of land emerged below, patches of green and the winding silver of highways. The descent had begun. The descent into Nashville began with an eerie stillness. The passengers, once bustling with private conversations and idle distractions, now sat in a collective hush. The recent outburst, the captain's announcement, and the formal tone of the crew had changed the atmosphere irreversibly. Emily remained seated, her hands resting on her children, her breath shallow but steady. Her eyes stayed fixed on the seat back ahead, her thoughts racing too fast to anchor in any one direction. Colonel Reed had returned to his composed stillness, his folder closed now, resting atop his lap. His expression was unreadable, but his presence, calm, grounded, unshaken, served as a silent reassurance. Emily, though still reeling, began to feel the difference between fear and strength. The fear was still there, no doubt, but something else had settled beside it, validation. The man behind her was no longer muttering. He sat quietly, arms crossed, eyes forward, the weight of his actions pressing down like cabin pressure at 30,000 feet. He no longer felt like the dominant force on the plane. That illusion had been stripped from him with every testimony, every recorded second of his behavior, every passenger who chose to speak. A woman too rose back, leaned slightly into the aisle and caught the attention of a flight attendant. When the attendant approached, the woman handed over her phone, its screen glowing with a paused video. The attendant reviewed it with a nod, then passed it forward. The action was silent, discreet, but full of purpose. Another man near the emergency exit raised his hand slightly and gestured to the attendant that he too had footage. A middle-aged couple across the aisle began talking softly about what they had heard from the beginning, piecing together the timeline. Slowly, the cabin filled not with noise but with movement, evidence being passed, stories being aligned, passengers finding their voices after nearly 2 hours of uncertain silence. Emily remained quiet, her body tense but still. Luke had fallen asleep at last, his head resting against her shoulder. Hannah had shifted too, eyes half closed, the noise and stress having worn her into a kind of uneasy rest. Emily held them both with the softness of someone who had weathered too much to loosen her grip just yet. Then, the woman with the phone who had recorded the incident looked over at Emily. Her voice was low, respectful. "I saw him from the beginning," she said. "You weren't exaggerating. I've got everything, from when he started talking about the kids to when he bumped you and spilled the juice. I didn't want to interfere, but I couldn't just pretend anymore." Emily blinked, caught off guard by the gentle offer. Cracked from exhaustion. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice. "You're not alone in this," the woman added. "Was until it got loud. You never were. We just didn't know how bad it." A strange wave of emotion surged in Emily's chest, relief, grief, fury, gratitude, all tangled together. She nodded once, not trusting her voice to do more. The older flight attendant returned, stopping beside their row. His face was now set in Something more official than customer service. He looked directly at Emily, then Colonel Reed. We've reviewed the footage. The crew has documented the reports. Law enforcement is waiting at the gate. Once we land, they'll board first. Please remain seated until you're addressed. Reed acknowledged him with a silent nod. The attendant turned to Emily. We should have acted sooner. Ma'am, I want to apologize for how things were handled earlier. Emily hesitated, then gave a soft response. You're acting now. That matters. The attendant's eyes flickered with something like guilt before he moved on. Reed looked over at her then, and in a rare shift, his expression softened. You handled it better than most would. He said. You stayed composed. You protected your children. That takes more strength than yelling ever could. Emily didn't answer immediately. The words, though kind, felt heavy in her chest. Strong. She admitted. I didn't feel. Strength doesn't require feeling strong. Reed replied. You're expected to fall. It requires standing your ground when. The wheels of the plane began to extend beneath them, the familiar clunk followed by a shudder. The land below grew closer. Nashville's outskirts came into view, green patches. Broken by roads, small industrial clusters, and the distant glint of airport tarmac. The cabin shifted slightly as the aircraft lined up for its descent. The passengers had resumed quiet conversation now. Not idle chatter, but reflection. Several looked at Emily with new eyes, not out of pity, but acknowledgement. One woman mouthed the words. You're brave. Another gave a quiet thumbs up. No one clapped. There was no dramatic applause or overdone gesture. Just silent recognition of a wrong that had been called out and was now being reckoned with. The seatbelt signs remained lit as the plane descended further. The final approach began, and the plane dipped gently. Emily gripped the armrest with one hand and held Hannah tightly with the other. Her eyes stayed on the window now, watching the ground rush up to meet them. Behind her, the man hadn't moved. Colonel Reed leaned in slightly, his voice low. After we land, they'll remove him first. You and your children will be escorted off next. There will be a chance to give your statement to the authorities. I'll stay with you until it's done. Emily turned to him slowly. Why are you doing this? His answer came without pause. Because it's right. The wheels hit the tarmac with a solid thud. The plane bounced once, then settled. A murmur ran through the cabin as passengers straightened, tightened belts, prepared for the unknown. They had landed, but for Emily, the journey was still unfolding. The aircraft slowed gradually as it rolled along the runway, the soft screech of tires followed by the whir of reverse thrust fading into a steady hum. Passengers remained quiet, each person grasping in their own way the gravity of what had occurred. The air inside the cabin, once filled with silent discomfort and concealed judgment, now held something else entirely, anticipation. Emily sat frozen. Her hand remained over Luke's shoulder, the other gently resting on Hannah's knee. The descent had steadied her, not because she was calm, but because her body had reached a limit. Her heartbeat slowed not from peace but fatigue. Everything she had contained during the flight, rage, fear, humiliation, pressed behind her ribs like an ocean held behind a dam. The captain's voice returned over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Nashville. We are holding position momentarily while local authorities board the aircraft. We ask that all passengers remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. Do not retrieve your personal belongings until we have been cleared. Thank you for your cooperation. A collective inhale filled the cabin. Seatbelts remained snapped. Hands stayed still. Eyes darted toward the front of the plane where, just outside the window, the shapes of uniformed officers began to emerge. Their presence, even before stepping on board, was a confirmation. What had happened was not trivial. It was being treated with seriousness now, and not just by the passengers. Emily's eyes met Colonel Reed's. He gave a single, subtle nod, no words, no encouragement. Just quiet solidarity. From behind her, she could feel the shifting tension of the man who had made her a target. His legs moved restlessly. A cough burst out of him, sharp and angry. He muttered something under his breath, and Emily didn't need to hear the words to know they carried the same bitterness as before. Then, the cabin door opened. Two officers stepped into the aisle with calm authority, accompanied by a member of airport security and one of the senior flight attendants. The head officer, tall and serious-eyed, held a notepad and wore a vest marked with aviation authority insignia. He stopped near row 13 and spoke clearly. "Passenger seated in 13C, please remain seated. We need you to come with us for questioning regarding an onboard incident." The man scoffed loudly, crossing his arms. "Questioning? I'm the one who's been harassed by a bunch of overreacting sheep and a woman playing the victim. This is ridiculous." The officer didn't raise his voice. "To remove you. Sir, this is not optional. If you do not comply, we will be forced." "On what grounds?" the man barked. The flight attendant stepped forward. Multiple passenger statements, video recordings, and written documentation provided by a federal officer on board. The man's face shifted. His jaw clenched. "Manipulated. This is some kind of setup. You've all been." But no one replied. Passengers nearby watched silently, not with morbid curiosity but with a collective sense of accountability. Every testimony, every glance, every moment of ignored discomfort had now solidified into something undeniable. This man was no longer just a loud presence. He was being held responsible. With a final growl of frustration, the man shoved himself out of his seat. His movements were aggressive but unresisted. He grabbed his bag from the overhead compartment with unnecessary force, then stopped. Turning to the cabin, he raised his voice once more. "Woman, for being loud enough. Hope it was worth it. Congratulations. You all rewarded a crying." No one spoke. Not one voice rose in defense. A few turned away. Most just stared. The man looked to Emily then, his eyes sharp with something between rage and disbelief. "I'll see you again," he hissed. "You'll regret this." That was when Colonel Reed stood. He didn't say a word. He didn't move toward the man or reach for any badge. He simply stood. His posture exact and solid. The officers flanked the aggressor instantly, placing themselves between him and Reed, between him and Emily. The man was walked down the aisle in silence. His footsteps echoed far louder than they should have. As the cabin door closed behind them, the passengers exhaled. Conversations resumed softly. Like a wind returning to a valley after a storm. The senior flight attendant returned to Emily's row. His face, now earnest and marked with deep concern, lowered to her eye level. "Ms. Carter, we'd like you to disembark next. The officers would like a brief statement. We will escort you and your children. Take your time." Emily nodded. Her mouth opened to speak but no words came. She blinked quickly and turned to her children. Hannah was awake now, looking at her mother with a mix of fear and confusion. Luke stirred beside her but didn't protest when Emily unbuckled his seatbelt and lifted him gently. She gathered their bags, keeping her movements slow and careful. Every motion felt heavy, final. Like closing a door she hadn't chosen to open. As she stood, Colonel Reed moved to let her pass. Before she did, she turned to him. "Thank you," she said softly. His response came without delay. "Didn't have to go through it alone. You shouldn't have had to go through this. But I'm glad you." She nodded once and stepped into the aisle, her children in tow. The flight attendant walked ahead, clearing a path. Another remained behind her, ensuring no further disruption. Passengers watched her pass, not with pity, but recognition. One woman touched her arm gently as she moved. A man nodded in her direction. A couple whispered something to each other and offered her a smile. At the front of the aircraft, just beyond the threshold of the door, stood two more officers. They greeted her with quiet professionalism and guided her down the mobile stairs onto the tarmac, where a van waited, its doors open, engine running. As she stepped out into the light, the sun bathed her in warmth. It was over. Not the entire ordeal. Not the repercussions or the conversations to follow. But this chapter, this flight, had landed. And she had walked off it not as a victim, not as a nuisance, but as a mother who had faced down humiliation, stood her ground, and finally been heard. The interior of the airport facility where Emily had been escorted felt sterile and subdued, white walls, thin carpeting, recessed lights humming above. It was quiet, but not oppressively so. There were chairs set against the walls, a counter where a woman behind glass organized paperwork, and a small waiting area where two security officers stood conversing in low tones. Emily sat with Luke on her lap and Hannah curled beside her, their small forms nestled into her sides. A bottle of water had been offered, but she hadn't opened it. Her throat remained tight, dry with the strain of everything that had transpired. She was still processing the blur of events after disembarking. The questioning had been brief and efficient. A quiet room, a calm officer asking clear, direct questions. Her answers had come in measured, almost mechanical fashion, each one carefully chosen, devoid of the emotion that sat, unspoken, beneath her skin. It wasn't until she watched a portion of the video playback, those first few moments when the man behind her began his verbal attack, that a tremor passed through her fingers. Now, she waited. She wasn't told what would happen next, only that she and her children should remain until final documentation was complete. Luke had fallen asleep again, his body slack with exhaustion. Hannah had grown quiet, her head resting against Emily's side, her small fingers looping loosely through the strap of her mother's bag. Footsteps approached. Emily glanced up. Colonel Reed stood in the doorway, no longer part of the background, no longer anonymous. He wasn't in uniform, but he carried the same presence. His jacket was buttoned neatly, his badge now clipped visibly to his pocket. A woman in civilian attire followed him, holding a thin folder. Emily straightened. Her body reacted instinctively to his presence now, not with alarm, but with attention. Reed approached slowly, his gaze scanning the children first before settling on her. "We've concluded the internal assessment," he said. "You've given a consistent and detailed account. The videos, passenger statements, and crew documentation all align. There's no further action required from you today." Emily nodded once. "And the man? He's in custody," Reed replied. "He will be charged under federal statute for disorderly conduct. Aboard an aircraft, with aggravating behavior against a guardian traveling with minors. He's being held pending further review. She absorbed the information, her eyes not moving from his face. Is that common? Not as rare as it should be, he said. The woman beside him stepped forward and handed Emily a printed sheet. This includes your incident reference number, flight details, and the list of agencies that will be notified. If you're contacted by any legal representatives or need assistance following up, there's a hotline listed. Here. Emily took it, folding it once before slipping it into her bag. Then Reed spoke again, more carefully now. I want to say something, off the record, not as a report. Emily met his eyes again, waiting. He continued. I didn't speak up right away because I was conducting a procedural observation. I've been involved in developing internal conduct protocols for the Department of Defense and other federal bodies. My presence on that flight wasn't random, I was auditing civilian military response procedures, specifically relating to ethical engagement and discrimination in confined public environments. Emily's eyebrows lifted slightly. She had suspected he was more than just a military officer, but hearing it confirmed felt like stepping into a different narrative altogether. I wasn't supposed to intervene unless there was clear violation, he said. But the moment he made contact with you, it became enforceable. The delay wasn't personal. It was about making the action irreversible. Emily took a moment before replying. You were watching everything. I was. Reed confirmed. I documented from the moment you boarded. Not just for you, for the environment. The crew's response, the passenger behavior, the escalation patterns. You weren't invisible to me. Those last words struck her unexpectedly. She had spent the entire flight feeling invisible. Isolated. But someone had seen. Not just the incident, but her. I felt like no one saw me. She said quietly. I did. Reed said. And I won't be the only one. This case is going into a larger report. What happened today will shape part of the framework for training responses, how staff identify threats, how bias affects inaction, how harassment escalates in silence. Emily looked down at her children. I never wanted any of this attention. I know, he said. But what you endured is helping us define how not to let it happen again. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then he added. There's one more thing. He pulled from his inner jacket pocket a sealed envelope and handed it to her. It's a copy of my report, the version that will be submitted under my name, not the redacted 1. It includes every entry I made during the flight, including my personal notes. Emily held it, uncertain. Why give this to me? Because you deserve to know how it was seen from the other side. How someone trained to look for danger saw courage instead. She didn't know how to respond. Her throat closed around the gratitude. She managed only a faint thank you. Emily looked down at her children once more. They hadn't stirred, even with the quiet conversation. Something about that filled her chest with an ache she didn't want to examine too closely. She stood, adjusting her coat, looping her bag over one arm, lifting Luke with practiced care. Hannah slipped her hand into her mother's without being asked. Reed stepped aside to give her the path. As she passed, he said. Made all the difference. You weren't loud. You weren't disruptive. You were protective. And that. She paused, just briefly, then gave him one last look. I'm glad it did. The next morning, Emily sat at the small kitchen table in her parents' house just outside Atlanta. Sunlight leaking through the blinds in narrow slits across the wood surface. The house was quiet. Her children were still asleep in the guest room, wrapped in unfamiliar sheets but finally at peace. Her mother had gone out early for groceries, and her father was in the backyard, tending to the garden he never spoke about but returned to each morning like ritual. Emily cradled a warm cup of coffee between her hands, its steam curling upward and dissipating just beneath her chin. She hadn't fully slept. After arriving late the previous evening via the military-arranged shuttle, she had showered, fed the kids, and sat silently in the living room long after everyone else had gone to bed. The events of the day continued to echo, flashes of the man's words, the looks from strangers, the sudden authority of Colonel Reed as he stood in defense of her and her children. It had been too much to process at once, and now, in the stillness, the reality of what she had endured was only beginning to take root. Her phone buzzed on the table. A number she didn't recognize, area code from Washington, D.C. She stared at it for a second before answering. "Hello. Ms. Carter, good morning. This is Ellen Browning. I'm calling on behalf of Civil Aviation Compliance Services. Do you have a moment?" Emily swallowed and sat up straighter. "Yes, I do. We wanted to inform you that a formal investigation has been launched regarding the incident aboard your flight. We received direct submissions from both military and civilian sources, including Colonel Thomas Reed's detailed account, as well as passenger video. The airline has been formally notified and has acknowledged receipt." Emily felt her pulse quicken. "What does that mean?" "The airline is required to perform a full internal review. Part of that includes reviewing crew response, passenger treatment, and protocol adherence. You'll likely be contacted soon by a company representative for a formal statement." Emily closed her eyes briefly. "Do I have to do anything now?" "No immediate action is required," Ellen said. "We're also calling to inform you that, based on Colonel Reed's recommendation, we're extending an invitation to you as a civilian speaker for the upcoming Public Conduct and Safety Conference in September. It's a closed event, primarily policy-driven, but your experience aligns with new initiatives around harassment response in public transportation." Emily sat back in her chair. "You want me to speak? You were at the center of a situation that highlighted serious gaps in our current system," Ellen said. "And your response, your restraint, your courage under pressure, demonstrates the kind of resilience our teams often don't get to hear directly from. The invitation is entirely optional. We can support accommodations and travel if you choose to attend." Emily didn't answer right away. Her mind had to stretch to even picture the scenario, her, on a stage or in a conference room, speaking about something she hadn't even fully unpacked herself. But then she thought of Luke, how he had clung to her without understanding why the world was so cruel that day. She thought of Hannah, who had sat in stunned silence as her mother endured silent assault. She thought of every stranger who had looked away, and those who finally chose to speak. "I'll consider it," she said quietly. "That's all we ask. We'll follow up with more information via email. You should also expect a formal letter from the Department of Transportation within the week." The call ended as professionally as it had begun, and Emily placed the phone back down gently. She stared at it, the quiet ticking of the kitchen clock suddenly sharp in her ears. Her thoughts drifted again to Colonel Reed, not just to his actions, but the precision with which he had predicted this next chapter. He hadn't intervened merely for justice in that moment. He had moved with the foresight of a man reshaping the aftermath. Later that day, as she pushed a stroller down the sidewalk near a park her parents frequented, Emily's phone buzzed again. This time it was a text message from Thomas Reed. "Just checking in. I trust you arrived safely. If there's anything you need, clarification, support, or just time to talk, don't hesitate. You handled yourself with more integrity than most trained officers I've seen under pressure. It mattered. She stared at the message for a long time before typing her reply. Thank you. I'm still finding the right words. But it mattered to me too. She didn't hear back right away, and she didn't expect to. Some messages didn't require immediate returns. They simply had to exist, records of human truth passed between two people who had survived something together, even briefly. That evening, another email arrived. This time from the airline. The subject line was formal: Notice of Active Review, Passenger Experience Acknowledgement. Emily opened it cautiously. The message thanked her for her cooperation, acknowledged the incident with solemn language, and confirmed that the airline's compliance division would issue a full public report once the investigation concluded. It also invited her to submit a personal account to be included anonymously in their internal training curriculum. At the bottom, it offered travel credit as a goodwill gesture, far from adequate, but at least a step beyond silence. She forwarded the email to a new folder she had created, Flight 2877, Ongoing. It wasn't closure. Not yet. But it was movement. And for a woman who had once felt like her seat was the only place she was allowed to exist. Quietly, movement was everything. Weeks passed. Then a month. Then another. But the memory of that flight remained etched in Emily Carter's life with the clarity of a wound that had healed just enough to become part of the skin. She didn't speak about it every day, nor did she allow it to define her, but it lingered in the quiet moments, when she zipped up Luke's jacket and remembered the cramped aisle, when she heard Hannah repeat something softly that echoed a phrase from the flight, when her fingers grazed the folder Colonel Reed had given her, now resting inside her nightstand drawer. Word spread quietly at first. A short news article in a local paper. Then another, more detailed. One in a national outlet that had obtained video footage from passengers who had posted snippets online. Though no names were released publicly, Emily could see herself in the way. The narrative was shaped: the exhausted mother, the belligerent man, the calm intervention by a senior officer. It didn't take long for the story to gain traction across social media. She received messages from strangers, other mothers, disabled parents, service members, airline staff. Some offered support, some shared their own stories, some just said they were grateful someone had finally spoken up in a moment when silence had become default. Emily didn't respond to most of them, but she read every one. She also kept in touch with Colonel Reed. Their exchanges weren't frequent, but they were real. Sometimes a short message, an update on the ongoing policy reviews, a forwarded article, a brief question about how the children were adjusting. Emily found herself looking forward to these conversations. Not because he had saved her, but because he had seen her. And kept seeing her, long after the flight had ended. When September came, she flew to Washington, D.C., alone. Her parents watched the children, and for the first time in over a year, Emily boarded a plane without them. It felt strange to walk through the terminal with nothing but a small bag and her ID. Strange, too, to feel a rush of anxiety as she approached the gate, only to be met with routine civility and no incident. Still, her chest tightened when she sat down, and only when the aircraft reached cruising altitude did she allow herself to breathe normally again. The conference was held in a federal building with tall ceilings and a solemnity she could feel in her bones. She was met at the door by a staff member who guided her through security, then to a small green room where she was offered coffee and a final printed version of her prepared remarks. She read them once. Then again. then folded the page and placed it in her bag. When her name was called, she stepped onto the low stage and stood behind the podium in a room of policy makers, aviation professionals, and public conduct advisors. There were no cameras. No live broadcasts. Just people listening. Emily spoke slowly. She didn't recite what happened in minute detail. That was already in the official report. Instead, she spoke about what it felt like. The silent disbelief. The way fear grows. When you realize no one will speak for you. The way that silence breaks something inside of you, and how long it takes to rebuild trust once it's shattered. She didn't cry. She didn't raise her voice. She spoke as she had on the plane, firm, steady, composed. And when she finished, the room was still. Then the applause came, not thunderous, not performative. Just enough to say, "We heard you." After the panel, Colonel Reed approached her. He wore civilian clothes, but carried the same composure. They didn't embrace. They didn't shake hands. He simply stood beside her, hands in his pockets, and looked toward the exit. "You spoke with purpose," he said. "I spoke the truth," she replied. They walked together through the hallway, neither saying much. But at the building's entrance, just before parting, Reed turned to her again. "There's something you should know," he said. "The man from the flight. He pled guilty. No contest. Fines, probation, and a permanent ban from all major domestic carriers. But more than that, his case has been added to a national training module. Every crew member on every commercial flight will see a version of what happened. You changed the policy." Emily didn't respond right away. Her thoughts spun back to her children, to the faces of those silent passengers, to her own disbelief that anyone would care enough to make changes. She had never imagined she'd become part of a training manual. Then maybe it was worth it, she said softly. "It was," Reed answered. They parted without ceremony. No promises. No expectations. 2 months later, she received a package in the mail. It contained a printed copy of the updated training materials. Inside was a letter. No heading. Just a single page with Reed's handwriting at the bottom. "Thank you for reminding everyone what dignity looks like." By then, Emily had started writing. Not about the flight, but about strength, visibility, parenting, and protection. She published a few essays online, and one was picked up by a major parenting magazine. She joined a small virtual group of solo parents with disabled children who exchanged stories, advice, and support. Her voice, once silenced in a pressurized cabin, had found a place in the open air. Hannah started asking questions about what had happened on the plane. Emily answered in pieces, in ways her daughter could understand. She told her about the importance of speaking up, about kindness, about standing beside someone who's afraid. Luke never asked, but he would reach for her in certain crowds, and she would hold his hand a little tighter. The folder with Reed's report remained in her drawer, untouched but never forgotten. Sometimes, Emily would take it out, not to read, but just to remember. To remind herself of what had changed. And that no matter how many rows back the voice comes from, someone, somewhere, is always listening.